Alright, so I accidentally almost opened Firefox instead of Audacity.
I haven't used Firefox in a while.
Firefox is weird because it works really well on this Windows 7 professional computer, but like upstairs, our main desktop, it only works, or it doesn't really work that well. It kept freezing and then they updated it and it worked fine, but Firefox is usually my go-to browser.
So what's going on now?
Oh, we're recording.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh,
I thought this was
were we gonna go into that one rant like from the last recording where we started
About
talking about
healthcare?
rights? Yeah.
healthcare, food.
Yep. Warning: this is about to get political. Neoliberals and neoconservatives may find themselves very twiggered.
So are we doing a political podcast?
We're doing whatever, dude. I
Whatever we want to talk about
This is just three basement dwellers talking to each
in the
other.
free country that is the United States of America.
Maybe that's what we do. Maybe we're all just basement dwellers. We refer to each other as basement dwellers.
I mean, are we sold on that channel name?
don't
I
know.
like it.
I like it.
Unless we go find somebody else that's doing it, which is
Or
entirely
something
possible.
similar, because yeah.
Which is entirely possible. There was a Simpsons episode about it.
Yeah, I think. So what were we talking? It was So the right to healthcare, that's an issue on its own. The food one is interesting. One could argue they're kind of similar.
Yeah. I mean, I think they are. Well, this is why whenever I talk about them, I always specify in our modern industrialized society. Because you also have a tendency to run into the problem now where nobody, like, really has their own farm anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So sustaining yourself is a little bit of a problem,
Yeah.
you know. So if there's ever not food in the grocery store, you do kind of have a problem. And I think there's also a problem where people have to recognize, and I think a lot of people don't, that the only way we're able to sustain this many people on Earth is
Yes.
due to like industrialized farming
Yep.
and our supply chain.
Yep. Yep.
And we watched with COVID, those things get interrupted.
You are
And,
correct.
you know, I almost thankfully didn't have to put my steel-toed boots to work, but, you know.
It's close.
I mean, there weren't like. I don't think there were like actual systemic shortages of food
It
at
was
that point.
nowhere near as bad as
It
they were
was
reporting.
most of the shortages were just people panic buying stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's what happened with toilet paper.
I
Yeah.
still don't understand the toilet paper to this day. Like,
Basically what happened was they said there might be shortages, so everybody thought, oh, bleep. What's something we need? Toilet paper. I'm going to go buy five boxes for no reason.
What's the saying in capitalism? There are occasionally bread lines. In communism, there is occasionally bread. Is that the saying?
I've never heard that before, but
I
I'm
don't-
going to use that now.
It sounds great.
Just to stick it to the commies.
It sounds like a fantastic thing.
Mm-hmm. So, am I going to be allowed to go on this,
You can.
Well, this one's even longer
The
than
text
the last
is
Yeah.
so
one.
small. I love it. Yes.
and it has footnotes, too.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
I wrote footnotes.
Yes. How can you not? Yeah.
Yep. So this started off was, I guess I'll say, a argument on Reddit. I'm not going to mention names or anything or go deep into it. That kind of turned into a debate, although I feel like they're still kind of arguing with me. But at one point, you know, they tried to say like healthcare. They were talking about like transition surgery, and that was like a healthcare thing, and therefore was a right. Well,
Sorry.
that also gets to my
I'm
thing.
sorry.
Like
Careful, that'll get you banned real
Oh,
quick.
yeah, it will.
everything.
If it's not recommended by your doctor, I don't understand.
Everything involving gender and sexuality, I believe, is a negative right. You are free
But
to
what do you mean
identify.
by negative and positive right? By the way?
Negative right is something in which you are right to be so, do so, think so, whatever, but nobody is obligated to provide you with the means to do so.
And what about positive
Positive rights are where people are obligated to provide you with the means to do so.
Is anything a positive right?
But that's what I'm about to get into. I don't think positive rights can actually exist,
Physically can't, can.
at least without infringing on the rights of others. But, you know, one of the things I argued was that being, like,
How about air?
any sort of gender
How about
or
air?
sexuality was a negative right. You are free to be so, but nobody is under any obligation to provide you with the means to be so. Which, I mean, you kind of think about that, that's like a little ridiculous. Like, how would I provide somebody with the means to be gay? Like, you see, it's kind of a...
Come on, you know the lowball answer. It's to provide your, your bum to this person.
Well, and then that's exactly what I said, is like, are you writing this down for censorship?
I'm just looking at the timestamp.
You might want to take a
You might
picture of the
wanna write it
timestamp.
down.
But,
6 minutes.
I could have said something far worse.
But-
I decided to go with the British slang.
well, and that's what I said too, is like, you're talking about like transition surgery being the only thing I could possibly think of, even in that realm, that isn't arguably superficial. Like, if a man wants to be trans, do I must have to provide them with women's clothes? Like, you could argue that's kind of superficial. I was actually watching, there was a movie, I guess it was meant to be maybe a shocker film, that came out in like 1954 called Glenn or Glenda, about like a transvestite and an early like transgender that got one of the early surgeries. And the transvestite made me think, like, you know, he felt comfortable in women's clothes, and that, and it kind of made me think why I called it superficial was, you know, if we didn't have women's, like, gendered clothing or gender roles, how would that change things? Which is why I called that superficial. Anyway,
Well, how would you define the word woman?
let's see, this is a minefield.
Oh my. I like that question. Answer it.
Well, usually when I debate these people, I like to entertain their things by saying anybody that identifies as a woman, because it does not change my argument at all.
So okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
And I
see
think
that too.
I think that's what they try to do, is they try to get you into those.
They try to trap you into saying something else.
They
Right.
don't want to argue about base rights because they can't argue them. So when I talk about rights, they exist regardless of gender identity.
Mm.
But
so
they-
it's not even about gender. at
They
this point.
only want to argue
that you're a bigot. They
that
wanna,
you're a bigot.
Yeah, they just want to attack you ad hominem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that, of course, you know, got into the debate of like healthcare being a right, and that's when I wrote up this entire. I don't even know if I can call it an essay. It's kind of incomplete. I meant to write more, and I could elaborate on that, about how the things that are generally considered to be positive rights aren't exactly rights.
Either.
At all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, at its base, nobody is obligated to provide a service to anyone else, be it healthcare, education, or anything else. Not only are these things, such as life, a negative right, but to require somebody to take on a role would violate their right to free will.
Mm-hmm.
Let me elaborate on that. In a modern sense, we have institutions, be it public or private, that provides the populace with goods or services that are commonly labeled positive in parentheses rights. Among these are healthcare, food, clean water, housing, emergency services, utilities, such as gas, electricity, water, telecommunications, etc. Some people consider telecommunications a right, education, transportation, and various other goods and services. Now, one of the things that I noticed, and feel free to like chime in, was that these commodities require a trifecta of 3 parties acting together to exist and function: infrastructure, bureaucracy, and people with specialized skills. To elaborate, the infrastructure may also need to be relatively modern and specialized for the purpose. As a generally accepted definition of this commodity changes, like for example, most people when they talk about healthcare do not talk about 1700s healthcare, they want modern healthcare. Well, then so must the infrastructure change. It is also entirely possible that brand new, unprecedented infrastructure must be constructed for this purpose.
Mhm.
So, we have infrastructure, we need a bureaucracy to run things generally, and for the most part, especially for things like healthcare, utilities, and such, we need people with specialized skills. In the first world, well, let me say, if any of these three parts fall,
You
the
don't have
entire system falters. In the first world, one generally has a steady supply of food available. If one were to visit a grocery store, one would find shelves stocked with adequate provisions and, pretty affordable. I think there's very rarely anybody in the first world that cannot afford food, generally. So
There
I'd
might
say
be arguments to that.
I'd say we're doing a pretty good job with that.
Comparatively,
Yeah.
yeah.
Plus, well, it's like in most of the first world, you kind of have to try to starve to death. Like if you're starving to death and you go knock on the door of a hospital or a church or you go up to like the fire station, they'll give you food.
Mhm.
We can provide that.
There's certainly food insecurity still, but
Yes.
I agree with you. I know what you're trying to say.
I don't think you can starve to death in any of these countries, is what I'm saying. Because we have this infrastructure, bureaucracy, and specialized labor. But, so you go to the grocery store, it generally has adequate provisions. This availability is the result of specialized infrastructure and efficient bureaucracy and people with specialized skills, including but not limited to agriculture, processing, and transportation employed in the industry. But if there were to be an interruption in the supply chain, for example, be it related to infrastructure or labor, the availability of this food is unable to be guaranteed. And I think that's what makes it different than a right, is because it is conditional. It requires people to work, it requires people to work together, it requires capital, your labor, that must be provided in order to bring this to you. Whereas a right, for example, like your right to free speech, is natural and unconditional. There are no conditions that must be met in order for it to be true. Like, food is something we can generally provide, but we cannot guarantee. And this is where I think it also gets interesting. Similarly, education requires infrastructure, bureaucracy, and specialized labor. If there were to be a labor strike among educators, this would cause an interruption in the availability of education. Although I did make a footnote, children may have certain positive rights to things such as education in which their parents are obligated to provide. Because, children, we believe, by definition, cannot provide for themselves. In this instance, an example would be an alternative such as private school or homeschooling, which is always allowed to be an option. But the thing is, in many of these industries or institutions, specialized labor is required where unskilled labor is acceptable. Basically, unless your acceptable level of healthcare is a healing chant, skilled labor with special education is required. If nobody with the particular skills is available, the system will falter. And this kind of gets into the rights of the people involved. Surely these people are entitled to demand a fair market rate for their labor. If these demands are not met, they have a right to find new employment as they see fit. So, we witnessed during COVID, we witnessed an alleged, I'm going to say alleged because I don't know if it's true or not, I kept seeing conflicting reports, but that's not the point of this, healthcare worker shortage. And a lot of these people were leaving their jobs because they felt they weren't being paid fairly, they were overloaded, didn't have the right benefits, whatever. But if we're going to argue healthcare is a positive right, and you possess the specialized labor necessary to provide healthcare, are you denying people their right to healthcare by not providing that labor? And this starts to become a thing where I think you have a right to look out for your own best interest. Now, what people say, that's the immediate, what's it called? Straw man argument is, oh, that's terrible. You're a jerk. You're an
So that means
asshole.
you want people to die,
Yeah, you want people to die. I hope you get a life-threatening illness and you die. You're gonna regret this on your deathbed. But the thing is, if we're gonna talk realistically, I'm pretty sure, like I said, you go knock on the door of the fire station, they'll give you food. If you showed up to a hospital, they would treat you.
Yeah, and then the insurance would bill you $1 billion.
Yeah.
In the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Or for example, if there is a person, John Doe, who works at a factory that produces vital medicine. John Doe works there as a man with free will. If there is another factory, say, making plastic toys, something completely non-essential, and this factory offers John Doe some advantage over the medicine factory, be it better benefits, increased pay, or intangible benefits that appeal to John Doe's liking, he may change jobs without regard to the product or service being provided. To deny John Doe the ability would be to deny him his rights to free will.
And we agreed that was that a negative right or a positive right?
I mean, your free will is, I guess, a negative right because, well, how do you provide somebody with free will?
Leaving them alone.
I mean, I suppose, yeah.
Pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
In fact, I would argue you have to put energy and economic resources to not leave them alone.
Mm-hmm. Now, could it potentially, and I see this in job applications all the time, oh, you're going to be working, helping people and providing an essential service, yay, clap, clap, clap. Will that get to some people? Yeah, oh, maybe, I don't want to chase that extra $2 an hour because, this is really needed right now. But you do have a right to change jobs, and I guess, if they're not going to give you what you want to stay there, it doesn't matter what they make, how essential it is. Yeah. You have a right to look out for yourself. Mm-hmm. Well, similarly, think about this, especially when I bring up people being forced to work. And the thing is, there are countries and there's historical precedents for this. If there is a woman, Jane Doe, who is deciding on a career path, and Jane Doe displays much intelligence and is said to have the aptitude of a doctor. Aptitude being the subjective definition of whatever aptitude is. Though Jane Doe may be of great benefit to her community to become a doctor, Jane Doe is free to pursue whatever education or career she so desires, regardless of communal need. To coerce Jane Doe into becoming a doctor would be a violation of her rights to free will and the pursuit of happiness. So, or in my example of the healthcare worker strike. The educators at a local school have presumably decided they're being treated unfairly, hence a strike, and have decided to strike, thus removing their skilled labor from the institution. Now, if that's the case, are they denying the children the positive right to an education?
Do we agree that education was a positive right?
Well, that's an interesting thing because there are alternatives that could also start to get into, I think, the idea that parents are kind of obligated to provide their children with food, shelter, clothing, mm-hmm. and if need be, education.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess there is an alternative there, but then again,
But those are things that the government decides that you have to do versus things that the government can't take away.
right, right. So, well, what are you saying by that?
I'm saying like the government saying that, you know, you as a parent have to, you know, look out for your kid's education
Mm-hmm.
is different than, you know, part of the Bill of Rights saying that the government can't do, you know, X, Y, Z.
Right. Yeah. I mean, then again, I guess if we're also going to go with the thing that children, by definition, are unable to provide for themselves, then, it's kind of like how I think that, the whole joke of, like, I'm not going to go down there because that's going to get weird. Well, people that are against age of consent laws and think it's a violation of, like, the right to free will, and that is like, no, because we've decided that children
Have a right not to be sexually coerced.
well, it's not even that, it's children cannot consent.
Yes.
It's a form of
Because
consent, yeah.
because they are under the age in which we have arbitrarily, and you have to set it somewhere, right? Because the age where they are arbitrarily able to make a choice, they're under that age. I constantly see people on the internet, side tangent, saying like it should be based on maturity, not age. Like, you don't suddenly become more mature at 18 than you did at 17 months, 17 years, 11 months, and
That's
30
true.
days.
Yeah, but that's not how our legal system
But
works.
at the same time, that wouldn't be a very fair legal system if, your girlfriend,
Then who decides this maturity? That
well,
brings
that's
up
also
this
the
whole
thing.
question.
It's a subjective maturity test, and that would not be the way our justice system should work if, like, your 15-year-old girlfriend was forced to sit there in a courtroom, take a subjective maturity test. If she passes, you're free to go. If she fails, you're going to prison.
Yeah.
That's not how justice
Unless
should
they
work.
decide to try a minor as an adult.
Well, you know what's interesting? The reason why they have, like, juvenile court is because because you can't exactly have a jury of children, they cannot be tried by a jury of their peers.
Ooh, interesting.
That's an interesting fact I learned,
I did not think of it that way.
and it kind of makes sense now. But yeah, generally, I think to be tried as an adult, you have to prove like it was heinous enough, and they were 100% aware of what they were doing.
That they had the intent of an adult, pretty much.
Yeah.
Interesting standard.
Yep. So in that sense, I think that, these positive rights technically cannot exist because they're conditional, can never be guaranteed. Also, they require the labor, capital, etc. of others who cannot be coerced
Basically,
to provide for you.
that right, it's in direct contrast sometimes to the right to free will.
Yeah. Like, for example, could you force those healthcare workers to work during the pandemic?
No, it's a direct violation of free will. It's because of free will, right?
Yeah.
It ultimately comes down to that.
It could it could also in other instances come down to, like, private property rights too, or, like,
Right. Medicine, for example. Are you obligated to provide a life-saving medicine for free?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think most people would agree it's good to try to strive to make them as available as possible and that, but like I said, at the end of the day, it can never be guaranteed.
Yep.
Yep.
I like that. That was an excellent, well thought out. I don't want to call it a rant because that's not what it was. It was a reasoned out thesis.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
What do you think, basement dweller who hasn't spoken that much?
As far as what?
Just any general thoughts? Do you think Any good examples? Any holes in the logic? Anything?
No, I mean, I think it was pretty sound.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's also the example I used, like in the, like for example, when I was just debating with this person and they asked like, well, like, and I kept asking like, who must provide? Who is the definition of a provider? Like, they use the example of like people need insulin, and I was like, and you.
Well, there was a time
you
when
have to-
insulin didn't exist, by the way.
That's
You
also
guys
a-
have to think about
That's
that.
also why I specify our modern industrialized society, because you're right. There was a time when these things did not exist.
So what did we do?
Mhm.
Right? We just let them die. I mean, we tried to treat them probably, but there wasn't even insulin.
Right.
So.
And if you want to try to argue like telecommunications being a right, well, there was a time when they didn't exist either.
Yeah.
We could attempt to bring it to as many people as possible, but again, it's literally entirely dependent on things that at their root do not naturally exist.
Mhm.
But anyway,
It's not like air, right? I keep bringing that up. It's not like air or sunshine. It's not.
yeah, that just naturally exists. Also, even I was thinking like clean water. Some people say that's a right, but the thing is, one of the problems we also run into is, like for
Well, it's a
example,
necessity, but that doesn't make it a right.
it doesn't make it immune to scarcity.
Yes.
Because I tell you right now, if let's say all the wastewater treatment plants in our area were to go down, there is not enough clean water to sustain our metropolitan area.
Oh no.
Like,
I don't think that's a specific problem to our area either. That's just,
yeah, it's many areas. So like, you see how we become dependent on those, and without these institutions, there is no way to get it.
Yeah.
So that's also kind of just a problem we've run into with population size and that. Maybe there is some sort of an argument too for pollution, like I guess you can't just go take a drink out of the creek anymore.
Yeah.
Not like I would do that beforehand, but okay, maybe you might have a little bit of a case there. But anyway, so the whole point becoming like, who must the provider be?
The
Like,
government.
well,
The
that's
popular economic argument.
Mhm. Well, yeah, but it's also the thing like, the people with the specialized skill, must they work? Like, well, the people that work at this insulin factory, let's say there's a labor strike there, and I keep bringing that up, but that's just kind of an example of like, I guess the free will. Are they violating this receiver's rights by not producing?
Well, technically, yes, but if you were to force them, you'd be violating their free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're going to argue that it's a positive right, that you have a right to receive this, then yeah, that's kind of a clashing thing.
And so, back to the question of who must the provider be, we can force the government to foot the bill on this one. We can, or at least think about it that way, right? That's the idea of, I think, public goods, right?
I suppose most people, like, if we're going to argue base rights, no, but I think, again, realistically, because the thing about philosophy is you talk in terms of the ridiculous,
Mm-hmm.
but I think most people would be like, well, obviously we need this to be produced, so yeah, the government will probably do something.
Let's step
Well,
in.
if the government pays for it,
Yeah,
someone
that's what I
still
mean.
has to provide it.
Exactly.
Yeah, the government maybe pays the wages of these people so that it's now economically better to work for the insulin factory instead of the toy factory.
But if
Yeah,
they
yeah.
still strike, I mean,
If they still
whether
strike,
the
they have to
government's
write.
paying them or private
Then,
hospital or something.
then the Roosevelt example, right? The government just sends in workers to produce the insulin,
Well,
which doesn't affect the free will of the worker.
Well, that's also an
But
interesting
what
thing
if they
too.
don't have the technology? Someone else owns that.
Then that, I don't think that's a right thing. That might be a feasibility issue.
That's also an interesting thing too with this refusal to work could also happen with the government, because think like, what
Oh,
if
then
they-
then that's like asset seizure, right? The government declares it too important, and then they just take away the right to
well,
property.
what happens if like
Right.
for
See,
example
now how
a
are you any
police officer
different than
strike?
like
You're
you
not.
know,
I'm not saying the
some-
government's fair. I'm just saying the government does what it does.
Well, like, that's also why I bring up the example of like what happens when like there are these police officer strikes. If there are people that think you have a right to like emergency services, that's an example of like government workers
Yes.
striking. So, right there, they bring in the government. Okay, well, the government workers are striking now and
Right.
not working.
Because
Yeah.
you can compare the government to an employer, like a private employer.
Well, and that's kind of my point too. Is regardless of who provides it, they can run into the same issues.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, so even if the government's providing it, the government too is limited.
Mm-hmm. It requires the specialized infrastructure, the bureaucracy, and in most cases, some form of skilled labor.
It requires resources, pretty much. So it boils down to a resource problem.
Mm-hmm. A resource which cannot be guaranteed.
Yeah, and that physically fundamentally makes sense. I don't even think that's a philosophical thing. That's a physics problem, conservation of mass problem, conservation of energy problem.
Mm-hmm. I mean, think if we were to go back to like 10,000 BC and there was a drought and you died, are you gonna claim like nature was violating your rights?
Yeah,
Well, again, talking in the ridiculous here, but
that would be your claim. You're
Mhm.
like, God didn't provide me with water. God didn't provide me with breathable air. God didn't provide the dinosaurs with enough food, and that's why they starved out during the winter.
well, it's just like if you were to die in a volcanic eruption, I do not think it's possible for something non-sentient like a volcano to violate your right to life
Yes.
because it is non-sentient.
Right. Yeah. So the real core issue is, I think then where it becomes, where you said, I think it becomes a significant talking point when we deal with the point where it's not ridiculous then, right?
Mhm.
Where we talk about when it's kind of close, right? Like, for example, the COVID healthcare workers, right?
Mhm.
When it's kind of close, you could kind of see both sides.
There is an interesting precedent to that. One of the things I could think of was like during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, there was a coal miner strike with winter approaching, and at that time people needed coal to like heat their houses and that. So with the strike wasn't looking like it was going to break, so eventually Theodore Roosevelt threatened to send the US military to work in the mines until an agreement could be reached, and of course an agreement was reached very quickly because no one was going to make money. So it's like that's kind of an interesting thing because I could understand the idea that like, well, obviously we don't want people to die.
We don't want a whole town to just disappear
Yeah.
and die. Yeah.
And I think it could also become that problem of like, well, thousands of years ago, well, of course, I guess there wasn't like a firewood collector, like Unga wasn't collecting firewood to
Unga.
sell to you. You collected your own firewood. But I guess, we have kind of reached a problem where it's not like we have forest fulls of trees and enough trees where, people could just kind of go cut down their own firewood and that. So it does kind of create an interesting problem.
Well, first, the central theme there is you need to agree that people have a right to live, right, for that particular case.
Right.
And that people need heat.
Right.
For that example.
Yeah. The right to life is generally a negative right where, like,
It's
nobody...
not guaranteed, man.
Well, yeah, I guess.
It's how life works.
I don't have to provide you with the means to live.
Mm-hmm.
Realistically, yeah, I'm not just going to pass up a choking person and be like, LOL, die. Like, I know the Heimlich. I'm going to do something.
I'm gonna try. Yeah.
I think, rights also differ from morals in that way, where it's like, morally, I'm able to do something. I feel compelled to act.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, so realistically, I'm pretty sure people would be like, yeah, we can't just have, like, entire towns.
Just dying.
Yeah. That'd look really bad. Of course, realistically, you could also say if there was, say, a strike at this insulin factory, there'd probably also be heavy pressure to resolve it very quickly because of this impending disaster.
Yeah. So we can say again, the interesting point is when it's close. When you
Yeah.
can kind of see both sides of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Hmm. I don't know if we should keep going or if we should just let this be one of those food for thought things.
We can keep going.
I don't know if I have much else to say because otherwise I could start going into the, infrastructure, like who must provide the infrastructure because well, it's kind of interesting, when people argue, well, they deserve to get paid fairly, and I'm like, yes, I agree, thus a problem.
Yeah.
you know. It's kind of like why I think I think even Karl Marx admitted that it was a total like idealist thing, but like I think why anarcho-communism would never work is because it just clashes directly with the labor theory of value that people own their labor and own the products of their labor.
Mm-hmm.
But then anarcho-communism says you're just supposed to produce extra for the benefit of your neighbors.
Yeah.
Like I find that to be a clashing thing, and I think he even admitted, yeah, that's a total like
Yeah.
fantasy.
Direct competition.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, again, arguing in the ridiculous. If we were all living like that and I had a farm and I made extra, yeah, I would give it to people, that needed it in hopes that, well, what if I'm in that situation one day?
Mm-hmm.
There is always that big exchange going on, but, yeah.
So what do we think of the opposite extreme, right? Some people argue that billionaires shouldn't exist if we still have people who are so poor they can't afford food. What do we think of that argument? In that case, it's more of a resource thing, right? What do we think of that?
Well, that's assuming that you think there's like a fixed number of resources.
That there are. Physically? Isn't that true?
Not necessarily. The economy can grow and we can create more things.
Right,
You know.
but in terms of physics, there is a carrying capacity. There are finite numbers of atoms. There's limited amount of energy, useful work that can be done in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
It does boil down to physics. There is a limit.
But I'm saying like if, as far as
I'm not saying we're anywhere near it, but like there is a limit.
extreme, like tangible displays of wealth, you can say like, some like, $300 million yacht that exists in the shipyard that builds it and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like that caters only to the super rich. So you have that, it exists, it's, a store of value. But if that, physical yacht didn't exist, it just disappears. It's not like, what are you going to do with it? Like, if it didn't exist in the first place, like, where are you going to get like $300 million worth of like food or like what?
Oh, I see what you mean. So you're saying, well, the idea is if that much labor was put into it, if that much economic value was put into the creation of that yacht, could those resources have been used to perhaps make better food infrastructure, better energy infrastructure to support more people?
But that wouldn't like happen otherwise.
What do you mean?
Like it wouldn't like.
Oh, you mean? Oh, so the idea is.
There's no incentive there.
There was no
anyone,
incentive.
If I'm a healthcare worker, I just point out I'm not working on the electricity grid. So it's not like I would be working on other products.
Oh, so the idea is. Okay, so you're saying.
So you're a yacht builder. That's what you've learned.
What you
Engineering
are.
or whatever. If that trade doesn't exist, like
would you have been nothing? Is that the idea?
Well, it's not like I guess what I'm saying is like it's not like okay, here is $300 million. We can either you know build a yacht
not
and give it to
fungible.
one person,
What you're
or
saying
we
is
can
not
like
fungible.
distribute a bunch of food.
It's not quite as fungible
Yeah.
as I'm laying out. I see. Yeah, yeah. So that goes back to your initial point where, yes, the resources might exist, but it does take people, it does take labor to convert said resources in a certain manner,
Mm-hmm.
be it for a billionaire or a billion people.
Mm-hmm.
And we can even bring in free will, and we could say, I mean, I guess it's that person's choice to work in a certain way, to work on converting resources in one way versus another.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Yeah.
So in the end, it's really about free will in that case.
Yep. I mean, there's also the argument, like, private property, like the idea that we should be able to, like, seize these people's property, like, we should be able to take their money. That kind of gets into issues with that. And, I mean, I think most people would agree that's wrong. Well, I say that, but,
Again, that gets into a hairy argument, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, it's kind of like there was a YouTube video that showed up in my recommended recently about some, like, sometimes not on my own YouTube channel, interestingly enough, because I don't want it showing up in my recommended. My personal YouTube channel is catered to my personality.
Nice.
But, like, upstairs I'll watch different things. And it was, like, Mega Yacht News. Something relating to, like, Mega Yacht News. I don't know if that was actually the name of the channel. Something about Russian oligarchs' yachts being seized. And someone actually was kind of brave enough to say, I disagree with this because I do not think that the seizure of private property should be used as a tool against people that are uninvolved with the government. The word, now, I may be uneducated on this, the word oligarch implies that they're involved with the government, but the idea behind that, why it scares me, is because, well, what happens the next time other countries decide, say, America is in an unjust war? Are they just going to be like, all right, Americans, your assets overseas are seized now because your government invaded a country? Is that a precedent we should be setting and using to solve, like, international crises?
that gets into the topics of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
War theory and game theory, negotiation. And it has to do with, like, personally, I think it boils down to, and you might have better thoughts on this if you know negotiation theory better than me and game theory better. I think it boils down to the U.S. does things because it can, because it has the military arsenal.
Frankly, yes.
It has the power. And same thing like Russia or any other. Like, if you have a nuclear triad, that is the reason why you are not attacked by another nuclear power, usually. Or, you are a friend of that country. So, like, there's retaliation. It's because they can. They have the ability to, so they do.
Mhm.
Right? I think that's what it boils down
Yeah.
to in this case.
We're not saying it's right, it just happens.
Yeah, I'm just
unfortunately.
saying, like, if you can beat someone up and nobody is strong enough to stop you, you just do it, right? Like, it's not I'm not saying it's good or bad. What you should do, that's a moral argument, right? But if that is the case and there's nobody else there, you could be king. And
Yep.
nobody has the ability to stop you.
Unfortunately, it just is. That being said, I mean, also just going back to the whole thing with billionaires, like, people think they shouldn't exist. I mean, again, I'll defend, like, their private property in that. Personally, they have their existence has no bearing on my life. Whether Jeff Bezos exists or not has no bearing on my life.
There's a lot of, that's not true. I think just from a physical standpoint.
I mean,
the existence of a billionaire just, like, it does.
But it's not the wealth that affects, it's the power that they have.
That is true. That is true.
Well, I
The
was
way
just I was just being a nit. I was just nitpicking there. How you said like a billionaire doesn't affect your existence. It kind of does. It's like trying to say a giant rock doesn't affect your view.
would I have more money if Jeff Bezos didn't exist?
We don't know.
Or would that money just be distributed elsewhere
See,
where I
again,
wouldn't
or
feel
would it
its
be
effects?
another billionaire, right? Like, so I'm just saying, just from a again, I like the physics standpoint. It's like there's a giant rock in the pond. Its existence does have some impact on you as somebody swimming in that pond, right? Like
Mhm.
whether you know about it or not, whether you feel it or not, whether you believe if that rock weren't there, it would be 100 little rocks, or the rock would just be somewhere else. It does have an impact on you, and it's non-negligible since it's so big. It's not like, you know, another random person where it's like a little marble and you can kind of ignore it. It does have a non-negligible.
But I think for the
big point.
purposes of this, like if someone has like, you know, 100,000 acres of land in Texas or something.
Oh, that's
I
what
mean,
you mean.
functionally, like really, I think I can say like
You're
that
far
doesn't
enough
really,
from it that you know its
Yeah.
gravity doesn't affect you.
But if that
Yeah, that's fair.
person, you know, owns like a bank and
But
they
let's
decide to
measure it,
freeze my
right?
assets,
Yeah.
then it's, you know,
It's a little
it's the
different.
power, it's not the.
It's a
Which
little
which
different.
could also be a violation of your rights then, because one of the things about positive rights is you do have positive rights generally, and this is like the right wing view on it, under contract. So
Yes.
if the bank freezes your assets, they are violating your rights.
Well,
I think in
that
some
depends.
cases, so like, kind of going along with like freezing like Russian assets and stuff, the trucker protests in Canada, they froze some of their,
supply chains.
yeah.
Hmm.
So, you know, maybe that's like closer to home. Like, is that, you know, a new tactic for, you know, trying to like get rid of annoying protests is like, you know, doing that.
Starve them to death.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a couple things we discussed there. It's the
Well, if also the thing I thought initially you were talking about the truckers themselves freezing the assets of like the companies they work for. And I was thinking if they were independent truckers, then no, because again, independent companies. If you worked for, say, you know, a national trucking company and you just like refused to drive your truck and they fired you, well, you know.
It was the government, like, pressuring banks to,
unfreeze.
Yeah. people
Right.
who were participating in it or donating to it.
So now the government is violating your right
Property.
to protest.
Yeah, protest.
You know,
By
well,
taking
that's
away
just
your-
I think blatant, right there.
Well, I mean, the other side of it is that they were like, you know, blocking a city,
Mm-hmm.
but should that be the tool that they go to?
I mean, I think there were things that I disagree with that too, where it's like I would read the news about like, oh, they're blocking things. I'm like, oh no, don't do that, because then you're being just as bad as like say.
Yeah.
I'll say it like we criticize like the violent
Blocking
Black
out,
Lives
yeah.
Matter protests, and it's like no, because if you do that, you're being just like them. I criticized that and said it was wrong. I'm one of my things I've tried to be the last few years is not be a hypocrite. Like try to recognize, well, if I disagree with it on this side, I must disagree with it on that side, and that's one of the things. Like I look at it and I go, no, don't do that, because you're becoming like them.
Mm-hmm.
You know. Mm-hmm.
But then it gets hard when it's like,
It's hard when you're.
I think
feeling
you
it.
should be allowed to like
There should be recourse.
determine what is like a legitimate cause or not. Like, I don't think you can say like either, you know, if something's bothering you, like don't protest and don't, you know, escalate if people aren't listening. But on the other hand, like, you know, not everything is
Not everything requires
legitimate. Yeah.
Yeah, that is very true.
proportionate response, pretty
Mhm.
much.
You know what I was also thinking? Given your like, how many acres in Texas did you say?
I don't know.
Oh, like if you own 10,000 acres in Texas and people always say that's wrong, I must ask, so if I didn't own this 10,000 acres,
Who would?
what would it be used for? Because, people always like to use the buzzwords of, oh, we could house people on that land.
Would you?
Would you?
Come on.
No. So, again, it just becomes one of those things like,
Like, yes.
it has no bearing on my life.
Right, this much potential energy, kinetic energy, chemical energy does exist. Would you actually make use of it? That's a different argument, right?
Mm-hmm. Which, again, would require people to act.
Yes. Requires some force in nature, some people to do things about it.
Yep. Mm.
Which means it's still regrettable that I didn't buy more mango nectar. It's gonna be a recurring theme on this podcast. Don't let things like that slip by. Life's too short. Life's too short. Buy that